good morning and welcome. This is Reflections. This is your presenter for today's program, Nouri Siddiqui. For our link up this morning, we have a special gentleman called John Homewood, and he's going to be speaking to us about the power of now, based on the work by Eckhart Tolle. Eckhart Tolle was born in Germany, graduated from the University of London, and worked at Cambridge University. When he was 29, a profound spiritual transformation virtually dissolved his old identity and radically changed the course of his life. He is now a counsellor and spiritual teacher. That's the author of the book, The Power of Now, that we're going to be discussing in this first of a 10-part series to look at the deeper aspects of what it is to live in the moment and to be totally present. John, are you there?
Good morning to you. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning.
My pleasure.
John, you've also been on a journey where you've evolved into a completely different person as a result of your awareness and moving into conscious living. Would you just like to share your story with us and who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm now in my early 50s, and I must say that the general journey for most people is that the first part of your life you spend finding yourself in the external world, in the material world, with family and housing and children and all of that. And then when you get to about 40, you tend to have a sort of shift in values and a shift in purpose. And there's an unease that comes out of, through you, really, to say that what you've been working with doesn't bring you the level of satisfaction that you had hoped it would. And so there's a realignment of direction. And for me, it probably happened about 10 years ago. And I had to reassess exactly the path that I was on. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I came across the book, The Power of Now. It was recommended by a friend, and I said, but, I know the power of now because I've been teaching it in my courses, because then I was doing training. And she said, no, but I really want you to read this book. So she lent me her copy, and I read the first chapter, and then I went and bought my own book. And I must say, out of all the spiritual teachers and motivational speakers that I've ever had in my life, I think Eckhart Tolle, with the concept of presence, has been the most transformatory tool for me. Because although it is just so simple to be present, I mean, it sounds almost absurd to live in the present moment. But when you really start to understand the depth of that philosophy or that way of living, it really is a tool to transform, where so many other people are speaking about it or about a situation of transformation. For me, Eckhart Tolle has made that transformation. And so the words that come through him are of such a high sort of frequency that the words alone are enough to transform people. And so I can attest to the help that, for me in my life, having walked this path of presence. And I'll give you one personal example. Last year, my mother lived in Hogsback in the Eastern Cape, and she wanted to move down to East London because it was warmer there than in Hogsback. And so we helped her move, and on the Friday after helping her move, we drove back to Cape Town. And on the Monday morning, I was in fact preparing a radio talk for another radio station, and my talk that day was going to be on grief and loss of a loved one. And then I got a call from a police guy to say that my mother's just been involved in a car accident. He's recovered her phone at the side of the road, and he dialed the last number, which was my number. And so I had to head back to East London, and while I was driving to the airport, in fact, I did the radio talk on grief and loss. And I know, when you reach a crisis point in your life or some profound sort of shift happens, how you deal with that crisis is really the determinant of whether you are in a stable sort of mind state and heart state or not. Because it's all very well to talk about concepts, but when a crisis hits you, how do you react? Do you react with fear? Do you react with anger? Do you react with anxiety? And in that moment, I know that I was faced with the choice. The choice was really to go into my mind, which is the old way of being, or to go into presence. And through the power of presence, I was able to experience the joy. And it might sound almost heartless for listeners to hear, but yes, there is joy in every situation. And I was able to really celebrate the life that my mother had led. She was 82 at the time. She was fit and well and healthy. And she did pass away 5 days later. But the joy that I was able to gain from that situation wouldn't have been accessible to me had I been caught up in my mind, in my thoughts. And that's really what plagues most of us, is our thoughts. And they say that only your thoughts can make you unhappy. And I know that to be true now. I don't just talk about it, but I really know it to be true. And through that situation, it showed me how far I have come on my journey.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, John. It's what's really powerful that comes out of that is that we do actually choose our emotional state all the time. And when we take absolute responsibility for that, we then have the right to choose to be happy.
Yes, the word choice is actually it needs to be understood in that quite often people say, we're choosing our thoughts and we're choosing our emotions and we're choosing our reality. But what part of you is doing that choosing? Is it the conscious part of you? Is it the part of you that can be in control? Or is it the subconscious part of you? And for most people, Nuri, it's the unconscious part. It's those patterns that we've been brought up with that just continually repeat themselves in our lives. They say that from the year when you're born to the age of 7, your brain is predominantly in what's called the theta mind state. And that's a state of superabsorbency. And you just absorb everything that's going on around you. And you also absorb your parents' patterns, your parents' conditioning, society's conditioning. And these patterns are laid down at a very deep subconscious level. And in life, they say that your conscious mind is able to focus on about 7 bits of information in a second, but your subconscious is processing over 40 million bits of information a second.
Wow.
So for most people, it's the unconscious that's controlling and making the choices and the decisions, and it isn't the conscious mind at all, and we just totally get caught up in our thoughts. And what Eckhart Tolle, in his book Power of Now and the New Earth, he gives tools to cut through that, to free us from those patterns.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, John. We're going for a short break in a moment. We're discussing the book The Power of Now, written by Eckhart Tolle, with my guest John Homewood. And the first chapter that we're going to cover is You Are Not Your Mind. So stay tuned. We'll be back after this. This is Reflections, and this is Nuri Siddiqui, your presenter for today's program. My guest today is John Homewood, and we're discussing The Power of Now, written by Eckhart Tolle. This is the first of a 10-part series, and in Chapter 1, You Are Not Your Mind, we're going to look at how actually getting out of your mind and into the present moment, you can actually create the power in the now. Now, those who have not found their true wealth, which is the radiant joy of being and the deep, unshakable peace that comes with it, are beggars, even if they have great material wealth. They're looking outside for scraps of pleasure or fulfillment, for validation, security, or love, while they have a treasure within that not only includes all those things, but is definitely greater than anything the world can offer. The word enlightenment conjures up the idea of some superhuman accomplishment, and the ego likes to keep it that way. But it is simply your natural state of felt oneness with being. It is a state of connectedness with something immeasurable and indestructible, something that, almost paradoxically, is essentially you and yet is much greater than you. John, how would you like to expand on that? That was an extract of Chapter 1 from the book The Power of Now.
Yes, it's so simply written, but it's very profound. When I first started reading this book, there are certain things that I initially rejected. And looking back, I know why I rejected them. And I rejected them because of my ego, because of who I thought I was. I had, in 1999, when I started to change my life, I started a company called Mind Enhancement Systems. I had been on a course which taught me about mind power. And I had discovered that what you think and what you feel, you create your life. And I started to take responsibility for everything I had created and started to work with my mind and my emotions to create a better or a different future. And I'd started giving mind power training courses. And when I started reading this book, the first chapter is that you're not your mind. And I thought, here I am teaching people how to increase the power of their mind. And along comes this guy and says, but you're not your mind. And it really, I thought, negated the work that I was doing. So I had a problem with that concept of doing away with the mind. And he puts forward the concept that the mind is actually the problem. And so initially I had a problem with that. But now I really do understand we mustn't get caught up on words. Words are always pointing us towards a deeper truth.
Yes.
And for most people, words are what create divisions. And it's when we define something, we put it inside our head, and we think we know what it is. But in fact, most concepts are not, we can't define them, we can't place them in a box. We try and do that with our mind, but it's not possible. So this concept of mind, for most people, it is who you are. It's your fundamental state of being. And Descartes made a statement, I think, therefore I am.
Yes.
And as Eckhart Tolle puts it, that is a fundamental error which most of us make. We think we are our thoughts. Who would we be without our thoughts? But in fact, if you really just consider this for a moment, where are the thoughts coming from? Who is that which is giving rise to the thoughts? And it is another part of you.
Yes.
You are the thinker. You're not your thoughts. And you are that which gives rise to your thoughts. So if you are something which is giving rise to the thoughts, you cannot be your thoughts. So there's another part of you. So that got me thinking that maybe there's a deeper part of myself that isn't my mind, that transcends the mind. And so for me, that was quite a fundamental shift to start to understand this concept. And I must say, 7-8 years down the path of this understanding, every single day I go deeper and deeper into this understanding. It's not something most of us can grasp in an instant. Some people do become enlightened in an instant, but I think that's a very rare occasion.
Right.
But for most of us, it's a journey. It's a journey of discovery. And the part of or the most fundamental part of the healing process is to separate your identity from your thoughts.
Right.
And for most people, that is the hardest thing to do because we have so identified who we are with our thoughts. And
so we've got to let go of the mask.
That's right.
So the mask actually stops us from allowing us to feel connected and allows us to give rise to an illusion of separateness from yourself and from the world around you, because you're actually not operating in a space of oneness.
That's right. Now, that mask is the egoic identity that we hold about ourselves. It's, as I say, when you're born, you get given a basket, and that basket is your name.
Right.
Parents lovingly give you. And into that basket, we put everything that happens to us and all the goodies we collect. We put our little toys into there. We put our education into there. We put our relationships into there, maybe even our children into there, and our job title into there. And ultimately, we think we are the basket. And there's nothing wrong with having a basket full of goodies.
Yes.
But the problem is when you think you are the basket, you become the basket case. That's
Absolutely.
Insanity.
Yes.
Because you're not the basket. You are that which holds the basket. And we get so caught up in this external identity, and unfortunately the external identity always brings us pain. Always. That's the nature of the external mind and the ego.
So ultimately our perception of ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, leaves us as an isolated fragment where we actually then start operating from fear and conflict within.
Yes, and that's right. And what you said earlier was so correct. You see, every basket is separate. Every identity is separate. Every mind has a separate identity. And it's that identity of being separate that creates this underlying fear, this underlying anxiety, this underlying perception that it's survival of the fittest. I've got to fight the world out there in order to be. And that's a basic error which humanity has made for many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, this idea of being separate, because separateness will always bring about a concept of me versus you, and that I'm not good enough, that I have to have more in order to be more. And that is a very profound shift when you start working with presence, because you start letting go of this egoic me, this little mind-made me.
Now, we often think of our journey to enlightenment as in hope and possibility of the fact that it will be the end of suffering. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's necessary to understand that enlightenment doesn't come in the future. It's not a future event. The mind, you must understand, works in time. The mind gets its identity from the past, and it looks to the future for its fulfillment or for its salvation. That is the nature of the mind. It's a four-dimensional tool, and the four dimensions are, well, the three dimensions of space, which is length, height, and width, and the fourth dimension, which is time. And the mind itself is a four-dimensional tool, so it always looks for who it is in time and for its fulfillment in time. But what we're talking about here is something that you're not able to really grasp with that time-based processor called the left hemisphere of the brain, and that is that the present moment is the only thing you ever have. It's the only place you can find your fulfillment. It's the only place you can find peace. And that present moment isn't based in time. It's the only thing you ever have, and only thing you ever will have is the present moment. If you think about your past, when you were there, it was the present moment. And we look to the future as if it's going to be something different. But when we arrive in the future, we find, oh my goodness, it's not the future, it's the present moment again.
Yes.
And in fact, there is only the present moment. And so enlightenment as a concept isn't something that you can get in the future.
No.
You get that by actually starting to disidentify yourself with time, with past, with future, and start to live more present, more fully in the now. And as you do that, so you start to reach a depth that wasn't available to you before when you were caught up in your thoughts about past and future.
And in which you are able to truly exercise your free will, which is your God-given right.
That's right, because as you become more present, so you let go of this past conditioning, of this subconscious conditioning, of these programs that are running around and around and around in your subconscious that are driving you. As you become more present, you become fully in control of your thoughts. So your thoughts stop driving you, and you start driving your thoughts. So in other words, you start being the conscious thinker instead of the unconscious thinker.
So you're getting behind the steering wheel of your own life.
That's right. And
Wonderful.
I use that analogy, in fact, to help people understand how we can move forward with this, and that is to pretend that you have a steering wheel in front of you. And when you find your mind wandering into the past or going into the future, just pull that steering wheel back into the present moment. So physically see in your hands the steering wheel and turn it from the left, which I would visualize as the past, into the center position, or as it veers to the right, which I would say would be the future, bring it back into the center. And the center is always what is now in my life, in this particular moment now.
John, I'd like you to hold that thought. Thank you for that. We're going for a short break. We're discussing The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle with my guest, John Homewood. We'll be back. You're listening to Reflections. This is Nuri Siddiqui with my guest John Homewood. We're discussing The Power of Now, and this is part 1 of a 10-part series. And before the break, we were looking at the essence of what it is to live in the now and the freedom of choice that we find within that, and the letting go of the past and the future to just be truly present. Now, when we start using the word being, then this is the concept behind that is perhaps to be eternal, ever present, and to go actually beyond the myriad forms of life that are subject to birth and death. However, being is not only beyond, but also deep within every form as its innermost invisible and indestructible essence. This means that it is accessible to you now as your own deepest self, your true nature. But don't seek to grasp it with your mind. Don't try to understand it. You can know it only when the mind is still, when you are present, when your attention is fully and intensely in the now. Being can be felt, but it can never be understood mentally. To regain awareness of being and to abide in the state of feeling realization is enlightenment. So, John, when we say being, are we talking about our spiritual connection? And if we are, then what is it that we're actually saying?
Yes, we are. If the mind again will jump in here and try and define being and try and put it into a box and say, well, I know what being is, now what's next? And that is a danger of the mind. We really get our identity from what we do. In fact, we get our identity from what we do, we get our identity from what we have, and we get our identity from what other people think of us. Those are the three aspects of who we think we are. And that word think is very important here. And it is really, that is the egoic mind. And we would really define ourselves as human doings. And what this part in Eckhart Tolle's teaching is pointing us towards is the understanding that we're not human doings. We are human beings. Now, we all know that, and yet we don't see the depth of what is being spoken about in that one word, being. What is being? And we will try and define it and try and label it and then say, yep, we know what it is, now let's move on. But it's in fact that part of us which hasn't got a beginning, it hasn't got a middle, and it hasn't got an end, because it's that part of us that's eternal. And the mind is everything that's in form. In other words, when I say in form, it is in form in time. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and an end. That basket that we spoke about earlier, that mask, that egoic mask that we put on, has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Because it's finite, it's in time. But what we're talking about here is that deeper part of us. So yes, to equate it with spirit, which I would say that part of us which is eternal, is very true.
So by being stuck on our own belief systems that don't work for us, which means to be stuck in our mind, and ultimately our thoughts are given birth to by our belief systems. So if those aren't working with us, and if they keep us disconnected from spirit, then we find ourselves in a total state of anxiety, actually, to be able to be in the moment and to choose our thoughts and feelings.
Yes. I think beneath thoughts and beneath beliefs, there's something even deeper, and that is really what's called a worldview. I would draw this as a triangle, an upside-down triangle, and right at the bottom of the triangle is what I would term a worldview. It's just that which you stand on, which you take absolutely for granted, you would never question. And then from that worldview arises your beliefs, and from your beliefs arise your thoughts, and from your thoughts arise your life. And what this, in Eckhart Tolle's book, and what he says right at the beginning, this is a worldview shift. This is a shift in your fundamental worldview.
Right.
That we stopped identifying ourselves as first and foremost physical beings, beings that are really created out of the mind, to an understanding that we are spirit beings, we are eternal, and we are participating in the world of form, but we're not created by the world of form. We are created by the formlessness outside of form. And it's that misperception, Nuri, that gives rise to what you spoke about just now, that feeling of anxiety. Because, although we sort of at the surface level believe that, yes, our bodies are real and the world around us is real and we are what other people think of us and we are what we do and we are what we have, although that's on the surface, there's a deeper knowing inside ourselves that knows that's not true. And so because we're continually striving to find ourselves out there in the world, we know that is taking us further and further away from our true self. And that creates a feeling of anxiety and a feeling of fear, because we know we're headed in the wrong direction.
So when we talk about the word being, then really it is to identify that nobody can claim exclusive possession of being, but rather that it's your very essence, and it is immediately accessible to you as the feeling of your own presence, the realization that you just are. And the detachment from the word I, that's very important, isn't it, John?
Yes, there's a little I, and there's the sort of bigger I, the more eternal I. You see, part of this worldview shift is that we have a current understanding, or most people have an understanding, that we are separate beings, that there's you and there's me and there's everyone else around us. But when you start to understand that there's only one life, that life manifests itself in different forms. It manifests itself in you, in me, in my sister, in my partner, in those people I meet at the shops. It manifests itself in people of other nations and other cultures and other races. But ultimately, there is only one life. It's manifesting itself in this area through different forms. So it manifests itself in a plant. It manifests itself in a dog or a cat. It manifests itself in a human being. But it's in fact indivisible. It is only one life. On the external level, it has different forms. If you look at your hand, and you point your hand out in front of you, and you can see that there are different extensions of your fingers. The fingers appear to be separate. They're all separate, but there's only one life giving rise to them, and that's the life that's contained within your body. So this fundamental worldview is a shift in perception to an understanding that there's only one, the real part of you, the beingness part of you, is one with all that is. It's manifesting itself for a short while as a unique individual. And in my case, it's an individual that's been given a name called John. And this individual was born at a particular time and will live a certain life and then will die. And that externalization of me isn't who I am. It's just that. It's just an externalization of an energy, and it is transitory. But that part that is real, that is eternal, is not disconnected from anyone else, and it's not disconnected from the whole. And that is what beingness is. It's the understanding that there is only one being, there's only one life, and that is all happening in the present moment. And when you start to understand that the present moment, life, and who I am in my true nature is one, that is a big shift. Now, that's a huge concept to try and get your mind around. And I would say that you're never going to get your mind around it because it's outside of mind.
Right. So, but ultimately, we're only one step away from the word being, because all we need to do is allow ourselves to experience it.
Yes. Now, the ego will say, yeah, that's all right for other people. You know, when I've sit and I've been in prayer for 40, 50 years, and I've fasted and I've done all these things, and maybe one day I will be able to get this, and one day I'll be enlightened or at one with my Maker. And that is thoughts of the mind because of the time-based me. But as Eckhart Tolle says, we're only ever one step away from it. And that one step is to bring your mind into, or to bring your awareness into presence. It's just your awareness that you have to move back into presence. And as you do that, all that isn't, and when I say all that isn't eternal. All that is part of the matrix of the mind. For those of you who saw the Matrix movie a few years ago, that said it so well, this matrix that's made up to believe the real world, but it's just a matrix. As you step into presence, so the matrix ceases to have its hold on you, and you can see through the world of form. I would like to just use an analogy here, if I may, to shift your perception. If you are standing on the beach at sunrise, and you witness the sun rising. It's a beautiful event. Now, I live down near Muizenberg, and most mornings I walk along the beach, and in winter I'm there early enough to see the sunrise. And so beautiful as it rises above the Hottentot Mountains and reflects on the water. And it's a very real event, and I can take a photograph of it. I can call my partner, my friends, to come and witness this event. It's very, very real, and no one can deny its reality. It's concrete. It's real. And 12 hours later, the sun sets, and maybe we go over to Camps Bay and we go and watch the sun set. It's a very real event. We can take a photograph of it. However, if we shift and we get into a rocket and we zoot up above the Earth quite high, and from that higher perspective, we can see the Earth turning beneath us, and we can see the sun shining. And the Earth is turning, and the sun is shining. And from that higher perspective, there is no sunrise and there is no sunset. Now, it doesn't deny that from a lower perspective, that is real. From a lower perspective, there is a sunrise and there is a sunset. It's very real. But as you raise your perspective, your whole view changes, and that is the fundamental worldview that is being put forward here. As you raise your perspective, you cease to be caught up in the world going around and around and around in your life and your story and your history and your future. You step out of that and you see the world very, very differently.
So the greatest obstacles that we give ourselves is really that we just get stuck with all our stuff. So it's that letting go and peeling off the onion layers. It's where we really need to begin. Is it not, John?
That's right, and that comes from the movie Shrek, if those of you who saw the movie Shrek, and he talks about it being like onions and layers and layers and layers. It's layers of mind, it's layers of misperception, it's layers of our story. And for most of us, we think our story is real. We think our story is our life. The story isn't who you are. It isn't your life. Your life is something that's eternal. Your life just is. It doesn't have a story attached to it. It's that which animates your body. That's real life. And most of us get so caught up in our story that we forget to live our life, because you can only live your life in the presence, in the absolute awareness of what is now.
So the compulsive thinker, which means almost all of us, we live in a state of apparent separateness, which is an insanely complex world of continuous problems and conflicts, because it's a world that is reflecting the ever-increasing fragmentation of our mind. So when we choose to step into enlightenment, we can be in a state of wholeness, of being at one, and therefore at peace. Now, this concept of oneness, a lot of people might grapple with that. How would you like to expand on the oneness, John?
Yes, well, first of all, I just want to go back to a saying that comes to mind here, and that comes from another teacher, and the saying is, you don't have problems, you only think you do. And if you really understand that, it's your thinking that creates the problems. It's not the actual event itself. It's what you think about the event. You think the event should be different to what it is. So we create concepts and expectations about a situation. And it's those thoughts that separate us from this beingness that we're speaking about, from this presence that we're speaking about. And as I said earlier, there is only one life manifesting itself through different forms. So another teacher said, love thy neighbor as thyself. And if you really understand the depth of what that is about, it's to see yourself in everyone around you. There's no one else. It is you having a different experience at a deeper level. And when you start to really understand this concept of what oneness is all about, you know, the Beatles some years ago sang a song, Love Is All There Is. And if you really start to understand that love is all there is, and it's only my misperception that blocks me from that awareness, and that misperception is that I am separate to you at a fundamental level, that I and you are separate beings, and in fact we are struggling for the same resources. We're struggling for a limited, finite commodity called love or self-worth, or that we're struggling for recognition in the world out there. And when you start to let go of those concepts, those limited beliefs, and step into the true awareness of who you are in your core, at your nature, then you start to let go of fear and anxiety. And really, letting go of fear is just stepping into a realization of your true nature, and your true nature is oneness. You are that beggar on the street corner at a deep, deep, deep level, at the level of life. You are. At the external form level, no, you're not. But at the deep level, at your essence, that which animates your body, animates his body or her body as well. And that is indivisible. And as I said, this is not a belief we're talking about. This is a fundamental worldview shift. The way you view the world changes. And a saying I quite often quote is, seek not to change the world, rather seek to change your mind about the world.
Yes.
And if you understand the depth of that, is as you change your mind, what you look at changes. As you change your mind about what you're looking at and the way you're perceiving it and the way you're judging it, what you're looking at changes. And the world of quantum physics, in fact, from a physical point of view, backs this up. Because what they discovered in quantum physics is there's no independent observer and observed. As you observe something, you physically change that. Now, that's not New Age mumbo-jumbo nonsense. That is quantum science. And that really shocked the scientists at the time to understand that just by doing an experiment, they interact and change what they're experimenting with.
Can you give an example of that, John?
Well, there's a scientist in America that's been researching and using random number generating machines. Now these might sound a bit peculiar, but they're like a digital clock that just produces random numbers. It's programmed just to produce numbers that have no sequence whatsoever. So the little clocks that tick away, and they just produce these random, meaningless numbers. And he has 60, I think it's about 68 of them set up around the world in different places. And what his 26-year research has been is how the mind influences these random numbers that are generated, because these machines are connected back into America, into a central computer. And what it does, the computer measures the randomness of these numbers. And what it measures is when they start going out of randomness. In other words, when they start producing some sort of sequence. And so his computers are able to monitor when they are running their most random and when they start running in a sort of pattern.
Right.
And what they find is that as we focus as a human species on one particular direction, so our mind is able to alter those. And one example which he gives in the study is, for example, the stroke of midnight every year on December the 31st. With that, everyone seems to focus on an event, on a singular event,
yes.
And that is the birth of the new year. And what he finds around the world, as the timeline shifts around the world, so the random number generators that are set up around the world go out of sync. They start producing non-random numbers. They start being predictable. Another example he gave was the death of Princess Diana.
Right.
When she died at her funeral, because the world was focused on a singular event, these random number generators went out. There is a correlation between what we think. There's a field of energy. It's called the field of energy and physical matter. And they found, for example, with 9/11 in America, that event where the world focused on, again, these number generators went out throughout the world. And that's just one experiment. There are many, many experiments to show how we are connected to that which we are looking at. They produce this machine which speeds up electrons almost to the speed of light. It's a huge, big accelerator, and these electrons go round and round and round, and then they crash into, they feed an electron into it, and there's a collision in the middle of this. And what they found was that the experimenter, the person doing the experiment, what he expected to happen in that moment happened. And what they would do is they would put different experimenters there, and whatever his expectation were these subatomic particles called quarks would appear in exactly the same form as was expected by the person doing the experiment.
Amazing,
and that
John.
was the first sort of glimpse as to show that what we think inside us affects what happens outside us.
John, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I'd like to talk some more on that. We're going for a short listening to Reflections. This is Nuri Siddiqui with my guest John Homewood. We're discussing the power of now. This is part 1 of a 10-part series. And John, just before the break, you were talking about ultimately how thoughts can become things using the dimensions of quantum physics.
Yes.
Would you like to just bring that into perspective and explain more about what was actually going on there?
Yes. Well, just it's very relevant. The ad that came up there was about stopping crime.
Yes.
And the way to stop crime is to report crime. Now, at one level, that's absolutely true, and I would urge people to do that.
Yes.
But that's the same as I said earlier with the sunset. At a certain level, the sunset is real, and as you raise your perspective, you find a different way of looking at it. And in one experiment which they did in Washington, D.C., in America, they got 10,000 people together to focus for 24 hours on peace. And they got these 10,000 people just to sit and focus on peace. And this was an experiment that was conducted in conjunction with the police force there. And what they said beforehand was that they can bring crime down just by focusing their thoughts on peace. And so the chief of police laughed at this, and they said, well, this is absolute nonsense. We need more policemen, not people sitting thinking about peace. But they went ahead and did that, and the crime rate dropped dramatically. I don't have the statistics at hand, but the chief of police was absolutely blown away by how crime dropped. As we change our mind, so the world changes. If we continually fight crime and fight rape and fight poverty, what we're doing is we're giving energy to that particular field of thought. And in fact, we're not curing the problem and not helping the problem, we're adding to the problem. There's more poverty relief now in the world than there ever has been, and yet there's more poverty. There's more people focusing on fighting poverty, and yet we seem to be generating more and more poverty. And what I would say is, as we start to realize that we have so much power inside us, as we change who we are, the world outside has changed. And another great man, Gandhi, said, you've got to be the change you desire to see in the world. So if we're looking for peace out there in the world, let's find it inside ourselves. If we're looking for love out there in the world, rather find it inside yourselves first. And another analogy I use is, if you take an orange, Nuri, and you squeeze an orange, what do you get out? You always get orange juice, don't you?
Yes.
And why do you get orange juice out? Because that's what's inside the orange. Now, when we get squeezed, what comes out? Does fear come out? Does anger come out? And if it does, it's not that which is doing the squeezing which is making it. It's inside you already.
Yes.
And it's to heal that inside yourself, to take the log out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of your neighbor.
Right.
To realize that it is all about the awareness that you hold inside yourself. As you hold more thoughts of peace, if you hold more thoughts of love inside yourself, you will find people will automatically treat you differently. They will start to respect you at a different level. And the world around you, your community, your family, will change as you change.
Beautiful. So ultimately, thinking has actually become a disease, and disease happens when things get out of balance, and ultimately because we are actually operating from a space of fear. We manifest a lot of the diseases in our body actually through our disease thinking. Yes,
that's right. And what you say there is so true, because there's nothing wrong with thought. There's nothing wrong with using thinking to navigate this world of ours. The problem is that we don't use thought. Thought uses us. These thoughts arise continually over and over again in our heads, and without any conscious control of our part, these thoughts just continually pop up into our mind, these patterns and these belief structures. We see someone in the street and we automatically judge them. We look at them and we judge them. Certain situations happen, we hear the news or we watch television, and we continually judge. And these judgments are all made through past perceptions, through these thoughts that are thinking us. And when you start to rather be, you start to see the world exactly as it is in this moment. And I'll give you an example. If you go into a beautiful rose garden, and there are all these beautiful roses, and you go up to one rose, and if you really are just present in being with that one rose, and you just there with it, you're able to see its magnificence of its unique form, because that one that you're looking at is completely and utterly unique. There is no other flower in the whole world that is identical to the one that you're looking at. And if you're able to really be with it in that moment and perceive it for what it is, you get the depth of what it's about. But for most of us, we'll just glance at the rose and say, oh, that's a rose. I know what a rose is. I've read about it in books. I've seen it before, and I've smelt it. You won't be with that particular rose. You're doing it in your head. You're not seeing what's really there. You're only seeing what you think is there. And it's the same as if you've been married to someone for, say, 20 years, and you go and sit with them and have breakfast. You're not sitting with them who they are today. You're sitting with them in your head of who you think they are, of patterns that you've built up over 20 years. And when they start to say something, you don't listen to them, because you say, but I've heard it all before. I know what you're going to say. And you actually have built a replica of them inside your head, and that replica is the one that you're having the relationship, not the real person anymore. And then one day something happens and you wake up and you find the person sitting there you don't know at all, because there's nothing like the replica that you've built up in your head. And that creates the dissolution of long-term relationships.
Very
is when we have to face reality from time to time and find that reality doesn't match what's inside our head.
That's called a wake-up call, isn't it, John?
It is a wake-up call, yes.
We're going to go for a break. We'll be back after this. You're listening to Reflections. This is Nuri Siddiqui with my guest John Homewood. We're discussing The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. This is part 1 of a 10-part series. John, at the beginning of freedom is actually the realization that you are not the possessing entity, the thinker. Knowing this enables you to observe the entity, and the moment you start watching the thinker, a higher level of consciousness becomes activated. You then begin to realize that there is a vast realm of intelligence beyond thought, that thought is only a tiny aspect of that intelligence. You also realize that all the things that truly matter, beauty, love, creativity, joy, inner peace, and many more, arise from beyond the mind, and you begin to awaken. That's from chapter 1 of The Power of Now. Where do we go with just allowing ourselves to let go and freeing ourselves, John, to bring us to the end of today's program?
Well, this concept of freedom, most of us are looking for freedom in the world out there, and we're waiting for laws to change or relationships to change or our parents to change or something to change out there to bring us freedom. But in fact, freedom is something that happens only with a shift of your own consciousness. As you change your consciousness, you become more free. If you are caught up in the programming of your mind, if you're caught up in your thoughts, if you're caught up with past patterns, there can be no freedom because you're not making choices. Freedom is really the freedom to make choices. And if you are not conscious enough to make choices from a conscious level, then you always will be prisoner to your past. You'll be prisoner to patterns. And you can change external circumstances, but in fact your life will just rearrange itself to come back to where you were. And I say to people, it's rather like moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. You have to actually make change at a fundamental inner level in order for it to change on the outside, because otherwise the outside will always only reflect what you carry on the inside. And that's a tool which I think is a very handy tool for listeners to take away with them, to understand that the world out there is a reflection of the world they carry inside themselves. And if we can just go to an understanding here, if you go into a very dark room, a black room, and you switch on the light, what happens? The light dissipates the darkness. Most of us believe that, no, we have to rush around the room with a broom trying to sweep out the darkness. No, you don't. The light does that automatically because the darkness has no power of its own.
Yes.
In fact, the only power that there is light. And so all we have to do to change the unconscious patterns, the negative thinking that we get caught up in, is not try and hit them on the head, not try and berate ourselves when we think a negative thought, but to just bring the light of awareness. All we have to do is say, that was a negative thought, or that was an unconscious program. I reacted instead of thinking about it. And it's just that light of awareness that changes it. Ego, as I said, doesn't like the light of awareness. It doesn't like the present moment because it gets its identity from the world of past and from the world of the future.
Yes.
So the ego will always try and make, when you have an enlightenment moment, it'll always try and make it into something in time. And one of the ways it does that is getting cross with yourself. It'll say, but why aren't you good enough? You're not doing this right. Everyone else is getting it and you're not getting it. But that isn't the way through. It's just to bring the light of awareness. That was a negative thought. That was a thought based in past. That was a thought based in future. And just that light of awareness, Nuri, slowly dissolves the darkness.
It's something that it's almost as if like if you want to go to the gym, and by repeatedly going, you will slowly get fitter and fitter. What appeared to be difficult in the beginning now becomes easy, and you actually look for a more strenuous workout because you're not getting stimulated from the first one you had. And so as a result, with your mind, what you're doing is you are exercising it in a way that brings you back to the now, back to the now, back to the now, until eventually you end up being autonomous with it.
Yes, it becomes your true nature instead of just something you do on an odd occasion. But there's nothing wrong with doing it on the odd occasion to begin with.
Yes.
And one of the ways that we can do a very simple exercise is to do this. If you just sit quietly for a moment and say to yourself, I wonder what my next thought is going to be.
Yes.
And you find, the next thought just jumps into your head straight away. But as you do that throughout the day, over and over again, slowly a little bit of a gap opens up between you saying, I wonder what my next thought is going to be, and what the next thought is. And it's that gap which is called awareness. That gap is called presence. That's when you know you're present, when there is no thought. It's not something that will happen easily. We've spent many, many years investing our awareness in the mind, in our thoughts, in our story, and it's not going to go away that easily. It's going to put up quite a fight. but it's just to continually take small steps in the direction you want to go.
Beautiful. And something else we need to get out of the habit of, which again is really about conscious awareness, is that the voice in our head constantly makes comments. It speculates, it judges, it compares, it complains, it likes and it dislikes. It always has to be right. So the voice isn't necessarily relevant to the situation you find yourself in at the time, and it may be reviving the recent or distant past, or rehearsing or imagining possible future situations. So here it often imagines things going wrong and negative outcomes, and then we get stuck into worrying. And sometimes this soundtrack is accompanied by visual images or mental movies. So even if the voice is relevant to the situation at hand, it would interpret it in terms of the past. So this is usually because the voice belongs to your conditioned mind, which is the result of all your past history, as well as your collective cultural mind setting that you have inherited. So when we see and judge the present through the eyes of the past and get a totally distorted view of it, we then end up wondering why we are worried, why we are stressing, and why we experience anxiety. John, that brings us to the end of today's program. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon for part 2 of The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle.